We're back with David Carey, President and CEO of Outrigger Enterprises, Inc. So, David, we were talking about education prior to the break, and you're very involved with the Department of Education and the implementation of Act 51. Could you share with us, first of all, what Act 51 is and your involvement in the implementation of that in the schools and the system?
Sure. Maybe if I could, I'll digress a little bit and talk about why I think my work in education has been so important. I was lucky. I grew up in a place where the public schools were thriving. I'm in the city and county of Denver, when I was a kid, had great public schools. In fact, the schools were so good that the two major private schools at the time were suffering for lack of applicants because the Denver public schools were so good. Things happened and it went away, but what it left in me is that, I was fortunate enough to have a great public education. Everybody should have that opportunity. So fast forward many years later, I'm looking as a senior business leader in the community at our public schools, and I'm going, our kids here, the 11,000 or so kids that graduate every year, don't have that opportunity. They didn't have the education that enabled them to go to a Stanford, to go to a law degree or a graduate business degree. What can I do as an individual or as a business leader to try to raise our public education system to a higher level? I think it's just a crucial thing for the success of our community. So in my role on the Business Roundtable, I was on the executive committee, and I've been chair of that organization. The Business Roundtable said, as the business leaders of the largest companies in Hawaii, we probably have the most ability to move the needle with government, with political leaders, and in the community on making education better. So one of the things that we supported was Act 51, which was an effort to try to begin to reform the ability of the public schools. The area that I had the most interest in Act 51 had to do with the so-called delinking. The public schools were responsible for teaching kids, but the repair and maintenance was in another department. It was with DAGs. Some of the legal stuff was in the Attorney General's office. A variety of other state agencies managed pieces of the school, including their own human resources. But we said, this is silly. If we're going to hold our Department of Education accountable for schools, they've got to be responsible for their own work, particularly in repair and maintenance, which all you have to do is walk around a campus today and realize that could be better. And so we suggested that the DOE should pull the stuff out of DAGs and put it into DOE, and that was the part of Act 51 that I was involved in. Part of that, they created this interagency work group, which was legislatively mandated, and we had the department heads of all these various agencies, including DAGs and the DOE, and we were charged with the responsibility of overseeing this transition. The legislature actually passed a law that said thou shalt transfer the repair, maintenance, and capital improvements work from the Department of Accounting and General Services, DAGs, to the DOE, and our job was to supervise that. It was originally done by the superintendent and the department heads, and finally the superintendent came to me and Don Horner and said, we all have too much of a vested stake. We need you community leaders who have an independent view to help lead and marshal this process. So I agreed to chair it, and Don Horner agreed to support me as vice chair of this process to move the DAGs folks into the DOE and give them responsibility for their own destiny. And that actually took place in July of last year, roughly. And I think it gives them the opportunity to say, we are responsible, and they can't blame another department for timing or anything else. So that's taken a tremendous amount of facilitative time, working with the government employees, saying it's going to be okay. In fact, it may even be better. Working with the schools to say, okay, now that you have this responsibility, you better do it well because we're watching you very carefully, and it's important to our children. If the buildings in the schools aren't right, the teachers can't teach. If the air conditioning doesn't work, if the power doesn't work, if the toilets don't work, it interferes with the educational mission. So fortunately, it was relatively easy to motivate people to see that, although it was tough to cause the state agencies to change. But I think we're making progress. The schools, are getting better. Their backlog of repair and maintenance are down. The process of designing and doing major capital processes is much improved.
What makes you want to spend your time doing these things when you're busy running a international hotel conglomerate?
My own personal mission is that God gave me special talents and skills, and what I want to do is use my talents and skills to make the lives of those around me better. So, public education, as I said, I was fortunate enough to have a great public education, and I would like to use my ability to enable other kids to have a great public education. Now, I also do some work on the private side. I'm on the Punahou Board of Trustees, and it's very interesting to see how it can operate when you have very motivated kids, very motivated parents, and more money, and no bureaucracy.
Are you able to share with us a story about somebody that maybe came up to you or shared with you their story about after you helped to implement, and even now, the Act 51, how it's changed, I guess, their school or their learning in school?
Well, I think I'm not sure there are specific stories other than there's hope that the process is going to be better. The other outgrowth of all of this work on the Interagency Work Group and Act 51 is that we were able to focus the public and in particular legislators and government on the resource constraint on fixing the schools. In other words, we have 260 some odd schools that probably have a capital spending backlog of somewhere between $400 and $600 million. And yet every year they had sliced the maintenance and operations budget and been relatively chintzy on the capital budget, the CIP budget. And finally, through this process, as we were trying to measure the performance, we said, boy, you better pay attention to the capital. And so out of that, I think, as this surplus came up in recent legislative times, people were more willing to say, yes, you're right, there is a problem, and we need to devote some more money to improving the buildings so that our teachers can teach. So, that's probably the largest victory as opposed to any single one victory, other than I talked to a fellow who was a former DAGS employee who's now in the school, and he says, now it's great. The only problem is we're swamped. We have so much work to do. We've got a little money and lots of work. But he was excited, and he saw that there was hope. And so, I feel like I've had some small measure of success, although I think our work is far from over.
Thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for more on Greater Good Radio.